the hardest wound is not being born with nothing. It is spending a lifetime convincing the people you love that you were never the failure they believed you to be. Those were the words that echoed through my mind as I stood outside the old brick church on the morning of my father's funeral, watching black sedans line the quiet street while distant church bells marked the beginning of a day that would change every story my family had ever told about me. My name is Daniel Carter, and for more than 50 years I carried a title that felt impossible to escape. To my relatives, my neighbors, and even my own brother and sister, I was the family disappointment. I was the son who never became a successful attorney like my older brother Michael or a respected financial executive like my younger sister Rebecca. Family reunions always followed the same painful script. Someone would ask how business was going, another would compliment Michael's latest promotion or Rebecca's beautiful lake house, and before long someone would smile politely before saying, "Daniel has always had a good heart." It sounded like kindness, but everyone in the room understood what those words really meant. They meant I had failed. They meant I had settled. They meant my life was something people politely ignored while celebrating everyone else's achievements. I stopped trying to defend myself years ago because no explanation ever changed anyone's opinion. They saw my modest pickup truck instead of the miles I had driven taking my father to doctor's appointments. They noticed my small ranch house instead of the weekends I gave up repairing my parents' home after storms rolled through our town. They compared retirement accounts, investment portfolios, and vacation homes without ever asking why I never seemed interested in chasing those things myself. My father rarely interrupted those conversations. He would simply sit quietly in his favorite chair with a thoughtful expression that revealed nothing. Sometimes I caught him looking at me for just a second longer than everyone else, almost as though he wanted to speak but decided against it. That silence became one of the greatest mysteries of my life. I often wondered whether he secretly agreed with everyone else. Maybe he believed I had wasted my potential too. Maybe every sacrifice I quietly made had gone completely unnoticed. As the years passed, those questions became heavier than any criticism my siblings could throw at me. When my father was diagnosed with heart disease nearly 7 years before his passing, the family promised to help. Michael said he would arrange the best specialists. Rebecca promised to coordinate schedules. They meant well, at least in the beginning, but successful careers rarely leave much room for unexpected responsibilities. Conference calls replaced hospital visits. Business trips replaced family dinners. Holiday cards arrived on time, but they often arrived without them. Somehow, without anyone officially asking, I became the one who filled the empty spaces. I drove Dad to appointments before sunrise. I waited beside him during long examinations. I learned the names of every nurse on his floor. I fixed loose railings around his porch, shoveled snow from his driveway during freezing winters, changed burnt-out light bulbs, balanced his checkbook whenever his eyesight became too blurry, and listened to stories I had already heard dozens of times because I knew they mattered to him. None of it felt extraordinary. He was my father. That was reason enough. Still, every holiday gathering reminded me how differently my siblings viewed the situation. They praised each other for sending expensive gifts while quietly assuming I had little else to do besides help our parents. Sometimes Michael joked that I had accidentally become Dad's full-time assistant. Rebecca once laughed and said, "Well, at least Danny finally found a career." Everyone chuckled except my father. He lowered his eyes and slowly folded his napkin without saying a word. I remember wishing, just once, that he would tell them to stop. He never did. Then came the phone call none of us were truly prepared to receive. My father passed away peacefully just after sunrise on a quiet Tuesday morning. He was 84 years old. The funeral brought together relatives from across the country, old neighbors, former co-workers, church friends, and people I had not seen in decades. Every conversation sounded strangely familiar. People spoke about my father's generosity, his honesty, and the successful family he had built. More than once I overheard someone compliment Michael and Rebecca for all they had accomplished. No one mentioned me unless it was to ask whether I was holding up all right. After the service ended and the final guests began leaving the cemetery, our family attorney, Mr. Howard Bennett, approached us with his leather briefcase tucked beneath one arm. His calm voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who had handled countless estates over the years. He informed us that my father's will would be read the following afternoon at his office and politely asked that all immediate family members attend. Michael smiled with quiet confidence. Rebecca nodded as though everything ahead would simply confirm what she already expected. I felt nothing except exhaustion. I believed I already knew exactly how the story would end because families like mine rarely changed their minds about people like me. What I did not know was that inside Mr. Bennett's briefcase rested one sealed envelope bearing my father's unmistakable handwriting, and before another 24 hours had passed, every certainty my family had clung to for decades would begin to fall apart. I barely slept the night before the reading of the will. Every time I closed my eyes, memories drifted back to moments that had quietly shaped the person everyone believed I had become. Long before my father became ill, our family had already decided which child represented success and which one represented disappointment. Michael had graduated at the top of his law school class. Rebecca had earned an impressive business degree and quickly climbed the corporate ladder. Their achievements were celebrated with framed newspaper clippings, graduation parties, and countless family stories that grew more impressive each Thanksgiving. My path looked ordinary beside theirs. After finishing community college, I accepted a maintenance position with our local school district because it offered stable hours and health insurance. The paycheck was modest, but I enjoyed honest work. I liked fixing things that people depended on every day. Broken furnaces in winter, leaking pipes, damaged playground equipment, flickering lights inside classrooms. At the end of each day, I could point to something that worked because I had taken the time to repair it. It was never glamorous, but it gave me peace. Unfortunately, peace was not a currency my family valued. During every holiday dinner, conversation somehow found their way back to careers and income. Michael discussed major legal cases. Rebecca described business conferences in Chicago, Seattle, or New York. Then someone would eventually turn toward me with an expression that combined curiosity and pity. They would ask whether I was still working for the school district. Before I could answer, someone else usually joked that at least public schools never went out of business. Everyone laughed politely while I forced a smile that became easier to fake every year. My father listened quietly through all of it. Sometimes I wondered whether he even noticed how those conversations slowly chipped away at my confidence. Yet despite everything, whenever my parents needed help, I never hesitated. When a heavy spring storm tore shingles from their roof, I spent 2 weekends repairing the damage while Michael attended a legal conference in Boston and Rebecca vacationed with friends in Florida. When my mother's arthritis became too painful for her to manage the flower bed she loved, I quietly planted fresh roses every spring because seeing them bloom made her smile. After she passed away 3 years before my father, those flowers became one of the few things that still brightened his mornings. Every Saturday, I stopped by with groceries before mowing the lawn, checking smoke detector batteries, changing air filters, and making sure his prescriptions were organized for the coming week. None of these routines were announced to anyone else. I simply did them because that was what family meant to me. I never kept score. I never expected applause. Still, there were moments when the imbalance became impossible to ignore. One Christmas Eve, after dinner, Michael proudly handed Dad an expensive luxury watch engraved with his initials. Rebecca presented a new reclining chair with electronic massage features. Everyone admired the gifts while complimenting their generosity. My contribution sat quietly beside the fireplace, wrapped in plain brown paper. It was an old family photo album I had restored page by page after discovering it damaged in the attic. I had spent weeks cleaning every faded photograph, labeling forgotten names, and preserving memories that otherwise would have disappeared forever. Dad opened it slowly. He ran his fingers across a picture of himself holding me as a newborn. For a brief moment, his eyes filled with tears. He looked toward me as though he wanted to say something important, but before he could speak, Michael laughed and said, "Daniel always finds the cheapest gift imaginable." The room filled with awkward laughter. Dad gently closed the album and placed it beside his chair without responding. That silence stayed with me far longer than the joke itself. As the years passed, my father's health steadily declined. His cardiologist recommended frequent monitoring, medication adjustments, and regular follow-up visits nearly 40 miles away. Michael insisted his schedule was impossible to rearrange because clients depended on him. Rebecca explained that missing executive meetings could damage years of career progress. I understood their responsibilities, so I never argued. Instead, I adjusted my own life around my father's needs. I traded shifts with co-workers, used vacation days for hospital visits, and quietly declined a promotion that would have required frequent travel because I knew it would leave him without dependable transportation. I never told anyone why I turned the opportunity down. When relatives later heard about the promotion, they assumed I simply lacked ambition. Even my Aunt Linda sighed and told me that some people were simply not meant for bigger things. I smiled politely because explaining the truth felt pointless. My father sat beside me during that conversation. He looked directly at Aunt Linda, then at me, and finally lowered his eyes into his coffee cup. Again, he remained silent. Looking back now, I realize those silent moments carried far more weight than I understood at the time. There was something he wanted the family to see on their own, something he refused to reveal before the proper moment arrived. At the time, however, I believed his silence confirmed every doubt I secretly carried about myself. By the following afternoon, as I parked outside Mr. Howard Bennett's law office beneath a grey summer sky, I walked through the front door convinced that my father's final wishes would simply reinforce the roles our family had been playing for decades. I had no reason to expect that before the meeting ended, the quiet sacrifices no one had valued would finally begin to matter. Mr. Howard Bennett's office occupied the second floor of a restored brick building overlooking the town square where my parents had taken us for ice cream every summer when we were children. The room itself felt timeless, with polished oak bookshelves lining the walls, framed legal certificates hanging neatly beside old landscape paintings, and a large conference table positioned beneath a wide window that overlooked the courthouse lawn. Everything about the space projected order, stability, and quiet professionalism. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always did, and chose a chair near the far end of the table. Michael entered a few minutes later wearing a tailored navy suit that looked as though it belonged in a courtroom rather than a family meeting. He greeted Mr. Bennett with a confident handshake before sitting near the head of the table without saying much to me. Rebecca arrived last, carrying an expensive leather handbag and a paper coffee cup. She apologized for being delayed by a conference call that had supposedly run longer than expected. Even on the afternoon we were preparing to hear our father's final wishes, work still seemed to occupy the center of her world. After exchanging brief greetings, an awkward silence settled over the room. It was the kind of silence that often follows a funeral, when everyone has already said the expected words of sympathy and nothing honest feels easy to say. I glanced around the table and realized that despite sharing the same parents, the three of us looked more like strangers than siblings. Mr. Bennett quietly opened a thick folder before adjusting his reading glasses. His calm expression revealed nothing about what was inside the documents before him. He began by offering his condolences once more, speaking warmly about my father's integrity and the respect he had earned throughout the community. He explained that our father had updated his estate plan several years earlier after our mother's passing and had reviewed it one final time less than a year before his death. Everything, he assured us, had been prepared carefully and legally. Michael leaned back comfortably, folding his hands with the relaxed confidence of someone who expected no surprises. Rebecca opened a small notebook and uncapped an expensive pen, almost treating the meeting like another business presentation. I simply listened. I had spent enough years expecting disappointment that I no longer imagined unexpected blessings. Mr. Bennett reviewed the family home, several investment accounts, retirement savings, personal belongings, charitable donations, and a handful of sentimental gifts designated for extended relatives. He carefully explained each section before moving to the next, never rushing, never allowing emotion to interfere with precision. As he spoke, I noticed Michael occasionally exchanging satisfied glances with Rebecca whenever another asset was mentioned. They never appeared greedy, only certain. To them, this meeting represented the natural conclusion of a successful life, and successful children naturally expected to inherit its rewards. I could not blame them entirely. That was how our family had measured accomplishment for decades. Then Mr. Bennet paused for the first time since the meeting began. He closed the folder in front of him, rested both hands on the polished wood table, and looked directly at each of us before speaking again. "Before we continue," he said quietly, "there is one instruction your father emphasized repeatedly. He asked that no one leave today until every document has been presented exactly as he requested." Michael smiled politely. "Of course," he replied. "We are in no hurry." Rebecca nodded in agreement while taking another sip of coffee. Neither of them seemed particularly interested in the comment. I noticed something different. Mr. Bennet's voice had changed ever so slightly. It carried the careful tone of someone approaching an important moment. He reached into his briefcase and removed a large cream-colored envelope sealed with dark red wax. Even from across the table, I immediately recognized my father's handwriting. His name appeared across the front in bold blue ink, followed by a simple instruction beneath it. To be opened only after my will has been read in full. The room suddenly felt much quieter. Michael glanced at the envelope before shrugging. "Dad always did enjoy being dramatic," he said with a small laugh. Rebecca smiled politely but said nothing. Mr. Bennet did not respond to the remark. Instead, he placed the envelope gently on the table as though it carried far greater weight than ordinary paper. He explained that my father had personally delivered the sealed letter to his office several months earlier and had instructed him to keep it locked in the firm's secure records until this exact meeting. He also made Mr. Bennet promise that no one, including himself, would read its contents beforehand. That detail surprised me. My father had never been a dramatic man. He believed in straightforward conversations, practical decisions, and quiet routines. If he had gone to such lengths to protect this letter, there had to be a reason. For the first time since walking into the office, uncertainty replaced resignation inside me. Mr. Bennet returned to the remaining pages of the will and continued reading. The family home would be sold, with the proceeds divided equally among the three of us. Investment accounts would also be distributed evenly after taxes and charitable gifts were fulfilled. My father's truck would go to Michael because he had always admired restoring classic vehicles. My mother's jewelry would belong to Rebecca. I received my father's collection of woodworking tools along with several family photographs and his worn leather Bible. The distribution seemed fair and uncomplicated. Michael appeared pleased. Rebecca quietly wrote notes in her notebook. I accepted the decisions without disappointment because they reflected exactly what I had expected. When the final page of the will was complete, Mr. Bennet carefully removed his glasses, folded them, and placed them beside the folder. No one spoke. Then he slowly reached for the sealed envelope, rested his fingertips upon the faded wax seal, and looked directly at the three of us. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said softly, "the will has now been read exactly as your father instructed." What comes next was, in his own words, the most important message he ever hoped his family would hear. Mr. Bennet held the sealed envelope with both hands for several quiet seconds before carefully breaking the dark red wax seal. The soft crack echoed through the room with surprising clarity, as though every sound had become sharper the moment my father's final words were about to leave the page. He unfolded several sheets of cream-colored stationery, adjusted them until they lay perfectly flat, and took a slow breath before beginning to read. "To my children," he said in my father's familiar voice carried through written words, "if you are hearing this letter, then I am no longer sitting beside you, and that is exactly why I waited until now to tell you what I should have said years ago." My heart tightened. Even though Mr. Bennet was reading, every sentence sounded unmistakably like my father. The steady rhythm, the thoughtful pauses, the quiet honesty that had defined him for as long as I could remember were somehow alive inside every line. "I know each of you believes this meeting is about money, property, and possessions. Those things matter because they represent years of work, but they are not the most valuable things I leave behind. The greatest inheritance any parent can leave is the truth." Michael shifted slightly in his chair, crossing one leg over the other as though trying to remain comfortable. Rebecca lowered her notebook onto the table, giving the letter her full attention for the first time. I sat completely still. For many years I remained silent when I should have spoken. Some of you may wonder why. I asked myself that same question more times than you could ever imagine. I told myself that one day the truth would become obvious without my help. I believed actions would eventually speak louder than opinions. I now realize I was wrong. Silence can become its own kind of injustice. Those words struck me with unexpected force. I felt as though my father were answering questions I had carried for decades without ever daring to ask aloud. Mr. Bennet continued reading. Michael, you have built a successful career through discipline and intelligence. Rebecca, your determination has opened doors that your mother and I were always proud to see you walk through. I have celebrated your achievements more times than I can count. But there is another success I failed to recognize publicly, and that failure belongs to me, not to the child who earned it. Michael's confident posture began to soften. Rebecca looked toward him briefly before returning her eyes to the letter. Neither of them spoke. Daniel, Mr. Bennet read, there were many afternoons when I watched you repair things around my home after finishing a full day of work. I watched you replace broken fence posts during the summer heat without expecting anyone to notice. I watched you shovel snow before sunrise because you knew I could no longer do it safely myself. I watched you quietly pay for groceries whenever my pension did not stretch far enough, pretending you had found them on sale so I would not feel embarrassed. I watched you miss opportunities that would have changed your own life because you believed your responsibility to family came before your own comfort. I stared at the tabletop, unable to move. I had never told anyone about those moments because they had never felt extraordinary to me. They were simply part of loving my father. Hearing them spoken aloud felt almost uncomfortable, as though private conversations had suddenly become public. Mr. Bennet's voice remained calm as he continued. The greatest mistake I ever made as a father was allowing the people around you to confuse quiet sacrifice with lack of ambition. Every time someone joked that you had settled for less, every time they measured your worth by comparing paychecks or job titles, I remained silent because I believed the truth would eventually reveal itself. Instead, my silence allowed a false story to grow stronger every year. The room had become completely motionless. Even the air conditioning seemed quieter than before. Michael uncrossed his arms and leaned forward slightly. Rebecca folded her hands together, her expression no longer confident but thoughtful. There were evenings after family dinners when I sat alone in my living room asking myself why I had not defended you. I convinced myself that you did not need my help because you never complained. I mistook your patience for protection. I now understand that patient people are often carrying burdens no one else can see. My throat tightened as memories returned one after another. The Christmas when my restored photo album had been laughed at. The weekend spent repairing the roof. The doctor's appointments. The holidays when jokes had replaced gratitude. Every one of those moments had remained vivid in my mind while my father had apparently remembered them just as clearly. If there is one thing I hope this letter accomplishes, Mr. Bennet continued, it is this. I want every member of my family to stop measuring people by the size of their homes, the titles on their business cards, or the numbers printed on their tax returns. Character reveals itself in ordinary moments when no applause is expected. The person who quietly stays beside you when life becomes difficult possesses a wealth that cannot be deposited into any bank. I looked toward Michael and Rebecca for the first time since the letter had begun. Neither of them looked back. They remained focused on the pages resting in Mr. Bennet's hands, their expression slowly changing from certainty into something I had never seen before. Regret had begun to replace confidence, and I realized my father's letter was only beginning to reveal everything he had carried silently for all those years. Mr. Bennet turned to the next page with deliberate care, allowing a brief silence to settle over the room before continuing. There are truths that deserve more than a passing sentence, my father had written. If I have asked you to sit through this letter, it is because I refuse to let my final act as your father be another moment of silence. I felt my heart beat slow as every word seemed to pull another hidden memory into the light. Several years ago, after your mother passed away, I began keeping a journal. It was not because I feared forgetting. It was because I feared that one day the wrong people would remember the wrong things. Michael raised his eyes for the first time since the letter had begun, while Rebecca quietly placed both hands on the table. Neither interrupted. Mr. Bennet continued reading. Inside those pages I recorded every visit, every conversation, every act of kindness that brightened my remaining years. I did not do this to reward one child or punish another. I simply wanted an honest record because memories have a way of changing when guilt enters the room. I felt my stomach tighten. I had never known such a journal existed. Daniel never knew I was writing, the letter continued. Most evenings he believed I had already gone to bed before he finished repairing something around the house or organizing my medications. After he drove home, I often sat in my favorite chair and wrote down everything he had quietly done that day because I never wanted those moments to disappear. My eyes drifted toward the window, suddenly remembering dozens of ordinary evenings that had seemed completely forgettable at the time. Apparently, they had not been forgotten at all. On March 14th, Daniel drove 42 miles through heavy rain because I called to say the furnace had stopped working. He arrived carrying a toolbox before I even finished explaining the problem. He stayed until nearly midnight to make certain the house was warm before leaving. He never accepted $1 for the repairs. Mr. Bennet paused only long enough to turn another page. On July 2nd, he cancelled a weekend fishing trip with friends because my blood pressure medication caused unexpected dizziness. He sat beside me for 6 hours in the emergency department, never once looking at his watch or complaining about the delay. I could barely remember those dates myself, yet my father had preserved them with remarkable precision. On Thanksgiving morning, he arrived before sunrise to prepare the turkey because my hands had become too unsteady to lift the roasting pan. When the family complimented the meal later that afternoon, he smiled without mentioning that he had cooked nearly all of it himself. Rebecca lowered her head. I remembered that Thanksgiving clearly. She had thanked Michael for carving the turkey while everyone praised the meal. I had quietly washed the dishes after dinner without thinking much about it. Acts of love are often invisible because they are performed by people who are not seeking attention, my father wrote. That is why they are so easy to overlook. But invisible does not mean insignificant. The room remained completely silent except for Mr. Bennet's steady voice. Michael and Rebecca, I do not write these things to make you ashamed. Both of you have built lives that required tremendous effort, and I have always admired your determination. However, success has a way of convincing good people that providing expensive gifts is the same as providing meaningful presents. Those are not the same thing. Your gifts made me comfortable. Your brother's time made me less lonely. Michael slowly removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Rebecca stared at the grain of the wooden table, blinking several times without speaking. There were birthdays when Daniel was the only person who remained after the cake had been eaten and the photographs had been taken. There were Christmas mornings when everyone else hurried back to flights, meetings, and schedules while he stayed behind to carry storage boxes into the attic because my knees no longer allowed me to climb the ladder safely. There were ordinary Tuesdays when no holiday existed at all, yet he appeared at my front door simply because he wanted to make certain I had eaten lunch. Tears gathered in my eyes before I realized they were there. I had never considered those moments worthy of remembering. They were simply part of loving my father. Hearing them described one after another made me realize he had been paying attention every single day. If anyone still believes Daniel accomplished little with his life, the letter continued, then they have misunderstood what accomplishment truly means. A career can earn applause from strangers. A faithful heart earns peace that cannot be purchased. I know because during my final years, the person who gave me the greatest sense of security was not the child with the largest salary. It was the son who never made me feel like a burden. The word settled over the room with quiet finality. I looked toward my brother and sister again, but this time I saw something that had never existed between us before. The certainty they had carried into the office had completely disappeared. In its place was the uncomfortable realization that while they had spent years judging my life from a distance, our father had been watching it from the closest seat in the house, and his understanding of who I truly was could no longer be ignored. Mr. Bennet allowed another quiet pause before lifting the final pages of the letter. His voice remained steady, but I could hear a trace of emotion that had not been there when the meeting began. "There is something else my family deserves to know," my father had written. "Some sacrifices remain hidden because the people who make them never believe they are worth mentioning. I have decided that those sacrifices should remain hidden no longer." My chest tightened as I listened. I had no idea what he was about to reveal. Several years ago, Daniel was offered a supervisory position with the school district. It would have increased his salary, improved his retirement, and opened opportunities that many people spend their entire careers pursuing. The position also required frequent travel across several counties and long hours away from home. He politely declined the promotion. Michael looked up immediately. Rebecca turned toward me with visible surprise. Neither of them had ever known that opportunity existed. When I asked him why, the letter continued, he smiled and told me that promotions come and go, but parents do not. He believed I needed dependable help more than he needed a larger paycheck. I argued with him because I wanted him to accept it. He simply shook his head and changed the subject. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. I remembered that conversation perfectly. I had never regretted my decision, but I had also never imagined my father had carried those words with him all those years. Daniel also believed I never noticed the financial burden my illness created, Mr. Bennet continued reading. He was mistaken. More than once I discovered hospital invoices had quietly disappeared before I had the chance to pay them. Whenever I questioned him, he insisted there had been an insurance adjustment or a billing error. I later confirmed there had been no mistake at all. My son had paid the remaining balance himself because he knew accepting money from him would have hurt my pride. Michael slowly leaned back in his chair, his expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and regret. Rebecca lowered her face into her hands for several seconds before looking up again. Neither of them interrupted. One afternoon, my father wrote, I accidentally found a receipt inside Daniel's truck while searching for a flashlight. It showed the payment he had made toward my prescription costs. I placed the receipt back exactly where I found it because I understood he never intended for me to know. That day I realized something important. The greatest acts of generosity are often the ones no audience ever applauds. I felt my throat tighten. I had forgotten that receipt even existed. If you are wondering why I never confronted him, the letter continued, it is because I wanted to see whether kindness remained consistent when no recognition followed. Year after year, it did. Nothing changed his character. Praise did not strengthen it. Criticism did not weaken it. That is a rare gift. The room remained perfectly still. Even Michael, who always seemed prepared with a logical response, had nothing to say. Mr. Bennet carefully turned another page. I know there were family gatherings where careless jokes were made about Daniel's career, his income, and the size of his home. I remember every one of them. I also remember watching him smile politely so no one else would feel uncomfortable. What none of you realized was that after everyone left, I often apologized for remaining silent. Every single time, he answered exactly the same way. He would place a hand on my shoulder and say, Dad, they are entitled to their opinions. We do not need to argue with people who do not know the whole story. Hearing those words spoken aloud brought the memory rushing back with remarkable clarity. I had almost forgotten saying them. Apparently my father never had. That sentence stayed with me for years, the letter continued. It taught an old man one of the greatest lessons of his life. Dignity is not found in winning every argument. Sometimes dignity is quietly continuing to do what is right even when no one notices. I saw tears forming in Rebecca's eyes. Michael stared silently at the polished tabletop, avoiding everyone else's gaze. If either of you now feels guilty, my father wrote, do not waste your energy defending yourselves or rewriting the past. Instead, learn from it. We all judge people too quickly. We assume the loudest success is the greatest success because it is easier to measure salaries than character. I made that mistake by allowing your brother to carry an unfair reputation far longer than he should have. Mr. Bennet looked down at the final paragraphs before continuing. The greatest regret of my life is not that I became ill. It is that I waited until these pages to publicly thank the son who quietly carried responsibilities that belonged to all of us. I hope this letter becomes the beginning of healing rather than another source of division, because families are strongest when truth replaces assumption. A deep silence settled across the office once more. No one reached for a phone. No one glanced at the clock. The meeting that had begun as a routine reading of legal documents had transformed into something none of us expected. For the first time in decades, my brother and sister were no longer looking at the man they had always called the family failure. They were beginning to see the person our father had known all along. Mr. Bennet carefully lowered the last page of the letter onto the table, but before any of us could speak, he reached once again into his briefcase. "There is one final instruction your father left for me," he said quietly. He asked that I wait until his letter had been read in its entirety before presenting the remaining document. He withdrew a thin blue folder bearing my father's signature across the front. Unlike the sealed letter, this document carried several official notarized stamps. Michael finally broke the silence. "I thought the will was complete," he said, his voice noticeably softer than it had been when the meeting began. Mr. Bennet nodded respectfully. "The will is complete. This is not an amendment to the estate. It is a separate legal appointment that your father established nearly 18 months ago." He opened the folder and adjusted his glasses once more. "Your father created the Margaret and Thomas Carter Family Community Fund in memory of your mother. It is a charitable trust intended to provide annual educational scholarships for graduating seniors from the local high school, along with emergency assistance for elderly residents who cannot afford essential home repairs or prescription medication." The room became quiet again. My father had never mentioned creating such a fund. "The trust has already been fully funded through assets that were intentionally kept separate from the estate described in the will," Mr. Bennet continued. "Its financial structure has been reviewed by accountants and approved under state law. The assets assigned to the trust are not subject to division among the heirs because they were transferred before your father's passing." Michael leaned forward slightly. "Who is responsible for managing it?" he asked. Mr. Bennet looked down at the document before answering. "Your father considered that question for nearly 2 years. According to these signed instructions, he appointed a single lifetime trustee, with the authority to oversee all distributions, approve scholarship recipients, and ensure the fund continues according to its original purpose." Rebecca slowly looked toward me before quickly returning her attention to the attorney. My heartbeat began to quicken for reasons I could not explain. "Your father wrote an explanation that accompanies the appointment," Mr. Bennet said. He turned to another page and began reading aloud. "I have been asked why I did not select the child with the strongest financial background or the greatest legal experience. The answer is simple. Managing money is not the same as managing responsibility. Responsibility begins with character. Wealth can be taught. Integrity cannot." No one moved. For the past several years, my father's statement continued, I have quietly observed how each of my children responds when there is nothing to gain. I have watched who arrives when no photographs will be taken. I have watched who keeps promises after the excitement of holidays has faded. I have watched who notices the needs of others without being reminded. Those observations have led me to one conclusion that I record here without hesitation. Mr. Bennet paused only long enough to glance toward me before reading the next sentence. "I appoint my son, Daniel Carter, as the sole trustee of the Margaret and Thomas Carter Family Community Fund because he has already demonstrated, through years of consistent actions, that he values people above possessions and service above recognition." I felt completely frozen. My first instinct was that there had to be some mistake. I had never managed a charitable organization. I had never asked for such responsibility. Across the table, Michael stared at the document with wide eyes while Rebecca slowly exhaled, as though the weight of everything she had heard during the past hour had finally settled upon her. Mr. Bennet continued reading. "This appointment is not a reward. It is a responsibility. Daniel understands something that cannot be measured on financial statements. He knows that every dollar entrusted to another human being represents someone's sacrifice. A person who respects sacrifice will respect stewardship. The attorney gently closed the folder before speaking in his own voice once more. Your father also instructed me to inform all beneficiaries that this appointment cannot be challenged on the basis of the estate because it exists independently under trust law. Every required document was completed while he was fully competent, and all procedures were witnessed and notarized. Michael slowly removed his glasses again, this time without saying a word. Rebecca looked directly at me for the first time since we had entered the office. There was no resentment in her expression, only quiet disbelief mixed with painful reflection. I looked back at both of them, uncertain what to say. The responsibility my father had placed in my hands felt far heavier than any financial inheritance. He had not simply trusted me with money. He had trusted me with his values, his memory, and the future of something that would continue helping people long after every one of us was gone. In that moment, I finally understood why he had remained silent for so many years. He had not been waiting for the perfect argument to defend me. He had been waiting for the day when the truth would no longer depend on anyone's opinion because it would be supported by an entire lifetime of quiet evidence that no one could honestly deny. For several long moments, no one spoke. The office that had once felt like the setting for a routine legal appointment had become a place where decades of assumptions quietly unraveled. Mr. Bennett respectfully gathered the documents into neat stacks but did not interrupt the silence. He seemed to understand that some conversations could not begin until people first confronted themselves. Michael was the first to move. He slowly placed both hands on the conference table and looked toward me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Throughout our lives, he had always appeared certain, confident, and prepared with an answer for everything. That certainty was gone. Daniel, he finally said, his voice lower than I had ever heard it, I did not know. Those four simple words carried more weight than 1,000 explanations. I looked at him quietly before answering. There was nothing to know, I replied. Dad needed help. That was all. Michael shook his head. No, he said softly. There was much more than that, and I never bothered to see it. Rebecca quietly wiped away a tear before speaking. I used to tell people you lacked ambition. She admitted. I actually believed I was encouraging you when I suggested finding a better career. I never stopped to ask why you kept turning opportunities down. She paused before continuing. I thought I understood your life because I only looked at the parts that were visible. Her honesty surprised me. It was not defensive. It was not an attempt to justify the past. It sounded like someone finally recognizing how incomplete her understanding had always been. I took a slow breath before answering both of them. I never expected either of you to organize your lives around Dad, I said. You both had careers, families, responsibilities. I simply happened to have more flexibility. Michael immediately shook his head again. That is exactly what the letter made me realize, he replied. I kept telling myself I was too busy, but the truth is that I never questioned my priorities. Every time I missed another doctor's appointment, I convinced myself someone else would handle it. I never stopped to think that someone else was always you. His words were not dramatic. They were painfully ordinary, and perhaps that made them even more sincere. Rebecca slowly looked toward the family photographs resting beside my father's Bible on the table. Do you remember the Thanksgiving when everyone complimented the meal? She asked quietly. I nodded. Dad wrote about it. She smiled sadly. I thanked Michael for carving the turkey because I assumed he had done the hard part. I never even noticed you had been there before sunrise preparing everything. She looked down at her hands. I cannot remember thanking you for anything that day. I smiled gently. You were enjoying time with the family. That was enough. She shook her head. No, it was not enough. I spent years believing generosity meant buying expensive gifts. I never realized the greatest gift someone can give another person is simply showing up. Her words echoed something our father had written only minutes earlier. I suddenly understood that his letter had never been designed to embarrass anyone. It had been written to teach us all the same lesson at the same time. Mr. Bennet quietly excused himself from the room for a few minutes to give us privacy. As the office door closed behind him, the three of us remained seated around the same table where we had entered as siblings separated by years of misunderstanding. Michael leaned back and quietly laughed once, not because anything felt humorous but because the truth sometimes arrives with an uncomfortable sense of irony. "Do you know what I remember most?" he asked. "Every Christmas I thought I was impressing Dad by buying the nicest gifts I could afford. I never noticed he seemed happiest after everyone left and you stayed behind to help him put everything away. I remember those evenings clearly. We would stack folding chairs, carry empty boxes into the basement, and drink coffee while talking about baseball, weather, neighborhood news, or whatever happened to cross his mind. They never felt extraordinary. They simply felt like ordinary evenings with my father." Rebecca looked toward the window overlooking the courthouse lawn. "I wasted so much energy trying to become successful that I forgot success was supposed to make room for the people you love," she whispered. "Instead, I let it become an excuse." No one argued with her because there was nothing left to defend. The truth had already been spoken more clearly than any of us ever could. A few minutes later, Mr. Bennet returned carrying 3 small boxes. He explained that our father had left each of us one final personal keepsake. Michael received our grandfather's pocket watch. Rebecca received our mother's handwritten recipe book. Mr. Bennet placed the final box in front of me. Inside rested a simple brass key attached to a small wooden tag. On the back, in my father's familiar handwriting, were just 7 words. "Thank you for always coming home, my son." I held the key in my hand without speaking. It was not valuable. It probably opened the old workshop behind his house where we had spent countless Saturdays fixing broken furniture together. Yet at that moment, it felt more precious than anything money could have purchased because it represented something I had spent my entire life believing I would never receive from my father. Public acknowledgement. Not because I had earned praise, but because he wanted me to know that every quiet sacrifice had been seen, remembered, and loved. 3 months passed before I unlocked the door to my father's workshop with the small brass key he had left me. Until then, I had not found the courage to step inside. The familiar scent of cedar, machine oil, and old pine greeted me the moment the door opened, carrying memories that reached back to childhood Saturdays when we built birdhouses, repaired broken chairs, and learned that almost anything could be restored if someone cared enough to take the time. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight streaming across the workbench where his tools still rested exactly as he had left them. I placed the key on the bench beside his worn tape measure and quietly looked around the room. Nothing inside was expensive. There were no hidden treasures, no stacks of cash, and no secret fortune waiting behind a loose wall panel. Yet somehow it felt richer than any room I had ever entered because every shelf held evidence of a life spent creating, repairing, and serving others. I understood then why my father had wanted me to have his woodworking tools instead of something more valuable. He knew I already understood the purpose of tools. They existed to help people. That same week I attended the first meeting of the Margaret and Thomas Carter Family Community Fund. Sitting around the table were teachers, retired neighbors, church volunteers, and local business owners who had agreed to serve on the advisory committee. As we reviewed scholarship applications and requests for emergency home repairs from elderly residents, I realized my father had not entrusted me with authority. He had entrusted me with an opportunity to continue the quiet work he believed mattered most. Every decision reminded me of the lessons contained in his letter. We approved assistance for a widow whose furnace had failed during winter. We awarded scholarships to students who had demonstrated kindness and perseverance despite financial hardship. We funded wheelchair ramps, prescription assistance, and small repairs that allowed older neighbors to remain safely in their homes. None of those stories appeared on the evening news. None attracted applause. Yet each one carried the same spirit my father had described so clearly. Weeks later, Michael called and asked whether we could have lunch together. It felt unusual because our conversations had always been brief and practical. We met at a small diner our father had loved for years. After ordering coffee, Michael quietly slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a personal donation to the family fund. "I cannot change the years that already passed," he said, "but I can decide what the years ahead will look like." I smiled and thanked him. A few days later, Rebecca asked whether the scholarship committee needed additional volunteers to review applications. She admitted she wanted to use her business experience to help students who lacked opportunities. Watching both of them slowly redirect their success towards serving others became one of the greatest gifts our father could have left behind. He had not divided our family with his final letter. He had quietly brought us back together. On the first anniversary of my father's passing, the three of us gathered at the cemetery carrying fresh flowers. We stood together in comfortable silence before Michael finally spoke. "Dad was right," he said softly. "We spent years measuring the wrong things." Rebecca nodded. "I used to think achievement meant being admired," she added. "Now I think it means leaving people's lives better than you found them." I looked down at the simple headstone bearing both of our parents' names and felt a peace I had never expected to experience. For most of my life I believed I needed to prove something to the people around me. I thought if I worked harder, earned more money, or gained greater recognition, the label of family failure would finally disappear. My father taught me the opposite. The truth never needed louder arguments. It only needed enough time for faithful actions to speak. I folded his final letter once more and placed it inside the restored family photo album I had given him years earlier. It seemed like the right place for it because both preserved the same thing. Not wealth. Not status. Not reputation. They preserved love remembered honestly. Sometimes I still hear people discussing success the way my family once did, measuring lives through titles, houses, promotions, or bank accounts. Whenever that happens, I remember the words my father left behind. Character reveals itself in ordinary moments when no applause is expected. Those words changed my family forever, but they also changed me. I no longer carried the burden of proving that I was not the failure others believed I was because the only opinion I had wanted all along belonged to the man who had quietly watched every sacrifice, remembered every unnoticed kindness, and waited until his final letter to make certain the truth would never again be mistaken for failure.